There we go. Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to Digital Hammurabi. And a very special welcome because today is the Ancient History Day 2021 that we've been working on for quite some time. I'll go into a bit of detail about what that is later, but I am very pleased to be joined by Dr. Eric Cline, who is here to talk to us about his book, 1177 BC. Dr. Cline, thank you for joining us.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me here on this day of all days.
Would you mind just introducing yourselves for our audience and telling us how you got into the field?
Sure, not a problem. So I'm a professor of classics and anthropology at George Washington University. I'm also the director of the Capitol Archaeological Institute at the same university. And I co-direct the Tel Kabri excavations in Israel with Asafia Sor-Landau of the University of Haifa. As for how I got into the field, well, it was all my mother's fault. She gave me a book when I was, I think, 8 years old about Heinrich Schliemann digging up Troy. And I finished the book and I announced I was going to be an archaeologist. And that was that. When I got to college, I majored in archaeology. And when I graduated, my mother gave me the same book again as a graduation present. And I've still got it. I've actually got 2 copies now, one at school and one in my home office. So it's one of those things, like many of my colleagues, I've always wanted to be an archaeologist, nothing else I wanted to do.
That is a wonderful story. Thank you for sharing it. And I remember seeing some of the photos from that excavation, and it's just wonderful, wonderful stuff. So we're going to just dive right into it. We're here to talk about your book, 1177 BCE, BC, the year civilization collapsed. What is so special about 1177?
What is special about 1177? Well, I would say there's 2 or 3 different takes on it. The actual year is special because that is the second time that the Sea Peoples attack Egypt. And they are attacking specifically during the reign of Ramses III. And that's going to be part and parcel of the late Bronze Age collapse, which we will talk about. But 1177, as the title for my book, stands for the larger late Bronze Age collapse, which is when everything that had been, I would say, humming along nicely for a couple of centuries suddenly and rather inexplicably collapses, comes to a shockingly quick halt, and everything goes away. The end of the Bronze Age is nigh. So 1177 for me is kind of shorthand for the entire collapse. It's like saying 476 is when Rome collapsed, which of course is not when it did. That took most of the 5th century. And the same way it takes most of the 12th century for the late Bronze Age to collapse. But so it's shorthand. So what's special about it is that this is a really interesting, interconnected, internationalized period of history that comes to a screeching halt. And there are a lot of parallels to today, which is why I think studying why they collapsed and how they reacted to it is actually relevant to us today, even though we're 3,200 years later.
Well, that is wonderful. Thank you. And we'll talk more about the parallels later, because the theme of today's History Day is Hindsight is 2020, Ancient Lessons for a Modern World, because I believe, and I think many other people believe, that studying the ancient world has intrinsic value, and it helps us to better understand the world that we're currently moving through. So what then is a systems collapse?
So a good question. Systems collapse is actually exactly what it sounds like. It's when your system collapses. It's a term that was basically coined by Colin Renfrew, professor of archaeology at Cambridge, back in the late 70s. And it's essentially when, if you've got a civilization, a society, a culture, and your centralized economy collapses, your population severely declines and or moves and migrates. The central administration, in addition to the centralized economy, everything collapses there as well. And basically you regress, as it were, to a lower level of socio-cultural complexity. So there have been any number of systems collapses over the years and in various places, from India to Eastern Mediterranean and the Aegean and elsewhere. And every time they are basically followed by what we would call a dark age, namely, they frequently lose the art of writing, for example, and they have to reinvent it. They lose, at least temporarily, the knowledge of how to build monumental constructions, and so on. So they regress. Sometimes the kings go away. Sometimes it's kind of a free for all. But there are certain hallmarks that manifest themselves in each of these systems collapses, and the late Bronze Age basically checks all the boxes for being a systems collapse. So life as you knew it basically ends, and you have to pick up, you have to rebuild, you have to reboot. And so that's one of the questions that I'm interested in is, I guess, what today we would call resiliency. How do you bounce back after you've had a systems collapse? Or do you bounce back? Does your land get vacated and new people move in and take over? Or do you claw your way back?
Lovely, thank you. And I never do this, but we have Nick in the chat from the Study of Antiquity and Middle Ages being very polite. And I'm bringing this comment on because, well, today is all about promoting different history YouTube channels. So if you've not seen his work, go check it out. He's a wonderful person. And he also has these fantastic mugs, which is very appropriate for today, as what I'm drinking my tea out of.
Yes, absolutely.
So
Nick's channel is absolutely great, and you can get a Sea People's hoodie as well.
Yes, and we have a Sumo hoodie also, which I wore last week, and then a baby promptly threw up on it. So that's it. It's in the laundry right now, so I can't show that one off. But Nick, thank you, and actually thank everyone who is joining us today. I appreciate your time and attention. So we've covered what a systems collapse is, why 1177 is special. When we're studying things like system collapse in the archaeological record and in the historical record, what kinds of evidence do we have to work with when we're trying to understand it?
Well, in the case of the late Bronze Age collapse, we've actually got a lot more evidence than most people might think. And by most people, I mean outside the field. The people within the field are fully, aware of everything that we've got. So there's a lot of data. But most of it has come about just in the last couple of decades, I would say. So this is actually one of what I would call history's mysteries. Why did the late Bronze Age societies and civilizations, why did they collapse? They were doing wonderfully right up until they suddenly weren't. So what happened? What caused it? So archaeologists and ancient historians have been arguing about this for, gosh, at least the last 50 years, if not more. It actually started way back when with one of the earliest French Egyptologists, Gaston Maspero, who actually started back in 1860. So that would be, 150 years ago. And he looked at some of the Egyptian inscriptions and said, these invaders, these Sea Peoples, as he called them, they're the ones that caused the collapse. But more recently, like you said, about 50 years ago, archaeologists and ancient historians, started looking at some of the other evidence. Was it, say, drought, for example, which Rhys Carpenter at Bryn Mawr College thought. He published a book in the 60s saying that drought had brought an end to the Mycenaean Empire in Greece, as he put it. So we've been discussing this then for a very long time. And what has happened is that we've got now data from different possibilities, shall we say. So there's evidence that earthquakes may have taken place. There is evidence that there was a drought, a very long drought, what we would call a mega drought between 150 and 300 years. There's evidence for famine. There's evidence for invaders. There may be evidence for disease. So the question is now, I would say not, why did it collapse, but, how, what caused it? Out of all these drivers or stressors that contributed to the collapse, which one was predominant? Which one was preeminent? And so that's what I was wrestling with in the book. when I wrote 1177 BC about 7 years ago, I was examining the various possibilities that people had suggested. And then in the end, I kind of said, well, here's what I think. And so I was kind of checking off the boxes. Could it have been an earthquake? Could it have been drought? Could it have been famine? Could it have been invaders? And my conclusion was yes. But
in all cases.
Exactly. And we can go into that in further discussion. But basically, we have lots of kinds of evidence. Part of the problem, though, is some of them are what we would call proxy data. Like, you can't actually see a drought in the archaeological record, except that you can by studying the pollen that you can look at under a microscope when you take a coring sample from like a dried up lagoon or a lake bed. By looking at the type of pollen, you can see what kind of trees and bushes and flowers were growing at that time. And so that's how we can figure out there's a drought, because we can see more hardy species that are more adapted to an arid climate, shall we say. So some of the, or not some, but a lot of the data are what you might call circumstantial, but everything is pointing towards what may have happened. So we've got lots of data, and it's things like Rhys Carpenter in the 60s when he suggested a drought. He didn't have that hard data. So wherever he is, he's grinning happily now that we've actually got that data. So there's lots and lots and lots of different types of evidence that we can use. The question is, what are we going to do with it in trying to figure out what actually happened?
Mm-hmm. And this kind of brings me to a personal point. When I read 1177, one of the things that really jumped out at me and that I really appreciated was how interdisciplinary the work is. And I think it really pointed to the importance of not just staying in one field or one specific area of a field. This work isn't just philology, it's not just archaeology, it's not just archaeobotany, it's everything. It really brings together all the different strands of evidence that we have to look at it and try and come to the best conclusion based on the data that's available.
Yes, absolutely. And that's in part why I think we're making such great strides now, is because everyone is open to being more interdisciplinary and working with each other. And as you said, some of the evidence, for example, comes from archaeobotany. That's what we were just talking about with the pollen or paleontology. Some of it, though, comes from texts, from philology. So, for example, famine. It's very hard to find famine in the archaeological record unless, like, you find a mass grave. But very frequently, and this is the case with the late Bronze Age collapse, they will write about it in their texts. So we've got text, for example, from Ugarit on the coast of what is now northern Syria, in which the king of Ugarit says, hey, there's famine here, we're all starving. And he asked the Egyptians to send up some food, basically. Same thing, the Hittites up in Anatolia, what is modern day Turkey. They also write and say there's famine in our land. Don't you know it's a matter of life and death? So we need the philologists who can read Hittite and Ugaritic and Egyptian. But then we've also got seismologists, in particular archaeoseismologists, who can tell us, yes, there is an earthquake here that took place in antiquity. And then we've also got basically the people studying climate change in antiquity. And they can tell us, they're the ones that tell us about the droughts and this and that, in addition to the paleontologists. And that's where it was very interesting for me when the first edition of the book came out in 2014. I was going with all the data that I could find, and I had compiled a fair amount, but I went to a conference I think it was the fall of 2014 in Belgium that Jan Driessen organized. And there were archaeologists there and art historians, but there were also people from the earth sciences. The earth sciences, they were studying the same thing that we were, but from their point of view, what was happening with the rivers and the rainfall and this and that and the other. And I realized that we had been working on two parallel paths. We had been looking at the same stuff. I had been citing some of theirs, they had been citing some of ours. And that was when, after the conference, I got in touch with them and said, here's what I wrote. What am I missing? And they're like, oh, yeah, you have some of it, but you're missing a lot of it. And not only had I missed some of it, but there was far more that came out in the last couple of years. So around about 2019, I said to Rob Tempio, my publisher, I said, we need a new edition of the book. There's so much data that is supporting, for the most part, what I had said, but it's just, wow, we're being overwhelmed here. And so that was when I wrote back to those scientists again and said, okay, we're going to do a second edition. Point me to what's been published in your field, and happy collaboration, interdisciplinary. And now I want to see if we can organize like another conference where we all get in the same room, because we are working on the same topic from two completely different directions.
And the new volume was published in February of this year, I think.
Yeah, just came out in February. Yeah, and I already have a file of things that have come out since then that I will have to put into the third edition whenever it comes out. But what I'm very pleased about is that the data is supporting what I had already said, which is good. But I did revise the ending because in the first edition of the book, I was perhaps trying to be too objective and too hands-off. And I basically presented the data and I said, here it is. And I think it's a perfect storm. I think everything interacted, because you can survive one of these, like an earthquake. You can survive maybe a second one, like a drought. But what if you toss invaders into the mix as well? And by the time you got 3 or 4 different catastrophes, you just throw up your hands and say, kind of, enough. So in the second edition, I actually bit the bullet and said, not only here's what I think, but here's how I would rank them. And the conclusion that I've come to, basically from all the new data, is that of all the different drivers and stressors, it really looks like climate change is the major one. And that is driving the drought and the famine and the migrations and all of that. So, and I know a lot of people today that are looking at the book are going, yeah, climate change, it's kind of the fad at the moment, and we're worried about it today. You're just kind of putting it back on antiquity. And I'm like, no, actually, I'm not. You can have climate change without humans, being responsible. We do it. We are now accelerating it, but it's not just the flavor of the moment. This is actually what it looks like happened. But there is everything else in there. I mean, earthquakes are not caused by climate change, or not usually. So, but the other thing that I wanted to figure out then is if we are looking at droughts back then what caused it? And that was something I hadn't looked at in the first edition. So now I've got a section on, was it a solar minimum? Was it rapid climate change? What was going on at the time? So, and I think there's a couple of possibilities, but what I have to say, what I really like about this is that I don't solve it. I tell you what I think, but I also give the data for everyone else to make their own conclusions. And I think that that's what the archaeologists and the ancient historians should be doing. We're not here necessarily to tell people what happened definitively. This is it. Everything else is wrong. It's more, hey, join us in this investigation. Here's all the data. Here's the conclusions that I've come to. Here's what I think is most likely. But, hey, you're an intelligent human being. What do you think happened? And we can all have an interesting conversation about it and either agree or agree to disagree, right? There are any number of people that keep asking me, why isn't the eruption of Santorini? Why isn't that what caused the late Bronze Age collapse? And I'm like, well, for one thing, it's too early. I mean, it's back in the 16th or 15th century. And here we're talking about the collapse at the beginning of the 12th century. So, even if this eruption of Santorini impacted things for 100 years or more, we're still 200 or 300 years later, and we know that the Minoans bounced back from it.
Mm-hmm.
So no, it's not. At least I don't think so. And then there's still people who say, "Oh no, I think it does." I'm like, fine, you can have your opinion, but
Mm-hmm.
I think you've got enough without the eruption. So anyway, this is where I think it's fun, for lack of a better word, that we can all debate this. And so that was what I was trying to do in the book, is not only put out all the data about what might have contributed to the collapse, but I told Rob, again, my publisher, that what I wanted to do also in the book was talk about the late Bronze Age, because frankly, not that many people know about it. And yet I think it's one of the most fascinating periods in history.
Absolutely.
So I spend the middle 2/3 of the book talking about 15th century, 14th century, 13th century, and the Hittites, Mycenaeans, Minoans, Assyrians, Babylonians, Egyptians, Cypriots, name your favorite peoples in that part of the world. And we talk about them because I wanted to show what was lost when it all collapsed. And like I said, I think there are a lot more similarities between them and us today than, again, most people realize. They had, wonderful marriages and terrible divorces, diplomatic embassies. They had economic embargoes, and we have, as you yourself know, we've got teachers trying to teach students how to write, and this, that, and the other. We can see all the tablets. Anyway, for me, it's a fascinating period, just simply made more fascinating by the fact that it suddenly collapsed for, I would hesitate to say no apparent reason, because there's too many reasons. The question is which one actually was the straw that broke the camel's back.
Thank you very much. And on the subject of climate change and archaeological climate change, if that is something people are interested in, one of the earlier videos that aired today on Flint Dibble's YouTube channel is actually looking at archaeology and climate change. So I would highly recommend that to people if you are interested. There is an Ancient History Day 21 playlist, and also all of the links are on our website, and that is running across the bottom of the screen now. So you can go there, find the videos you're interested in. Again, climate change and archaeology is Flint Dibble's thing. I would recommend it. So we've kind of...
I would also recommend it. Flint is doing absolutely wonderful work. And he's also teamed up and sometimes with Martin Finet and Erica Weiberg and others. So if you're interested in climate change and antiquity, definitely watch Flint's video, but you can also read what he's written if you're interested in going further.
He has a fantastic Twitter account as well, so go there, get some education. And if you do look at any of the videos that are being aired today, please subscribe to the channels if you enjoy what you're seeing, and leave a comment for the creators, because they've all worked very, very hard to get this thing off the ground. Okay, so we've talked about what systems collapse is, why, well, some of the contributing factors to the late Bronze Age collapse. What's happened then after civilization ended? How did people react to it?
Oh boy. So what didn't happen? Well, this is actually what I'm working on right now. So I'm working on the sequel. It's simply called After 1177. And the subtitle is The Rebirth of Civilization. It's more like a reboot in a way, but this is where resiliency and transformation and the like come into play. And again, this is, I think, extremely relevant to today, because resiliency is one of the buzzwords that we throw around when talking about societies and problems around today. So basically what happened, I guess you could almost say that there are 7 or 8 case studies as to what happened after the collapse, because each of these societies responded differently. So we've got, what did the Mycenaeans do? What did the Minoans do? What did the Assyrians do? How did the Egyptians react? What happened to the Hittites? What about the Cypriots? And so I was actually thinking of having each of the chapters being a case study. But then I thought, no, I'm still interested in the interactions between them all. So right now I'm writing it in the same way that I did 1177, that is by centuries. So rest of the 12th century, 11th century, 10th century, 9th century. And I'm doing 400 years. I'm doing 1176, the year after, to 776, which is technically the first Olympics in Greece. And that seemed to me to be a nice cutoff point, though I could keep going and going and going. So what I'm finding is that each of the societies reacts differently. Some do simply transform. And I've actually come around to thinking that part of the collapse of the late Bronze Age is actually more like a transformation as opposed to a sheer collapse. So, and I've seen that some of the people are saying that collapse and transformation are two sides of the same coin. So some of the societies transform. Others, though, do collapse. So, for example, I would say the Mycenaeans, they collapse. They're not really transforming. They're collapsing and regressing back to that lower sociocultural, economic, societal position. They lose the art of writing. They don't know how to do linear B anymore, basically. Central economy collapses, central administration collapses. We get a lot of population decline and migration. I've seen figures anywhere from 1/3 to 3/4 of the population died or migrated in Greece immediately after the Bronze Age. But it is very difficult to calculate those kind of numbers. So I'm working on that at the moment. But I would say that the Mycenaeans then represent one of the societies that really collapse almost as much as possible, though there are survivors. I mean, not everybody dies. It does take them a couple of hundred years to pull themselves back up. And they seem to do it with the help of people from the Eastern Mediterranean. It looks like the Cypriots continue to trade with them. And in fact, the Cypriots have transformed rather than collapsed. Cyprus, of course, used to be where the major copper came from. And there is still some copper being worked. But it looks like as part of the Bronze Age collapse, the routes for tin to Afghanistan might have been cut. I think they probably were, but this is a matter of debate. But even if the tin kept coming, the market dropped out for a demand for bronze, right? You make bronze with 90% copper and 10% tin. But if you don't have your Mycenaean kings anymore, and they don't need to buy your bronze, then the Cypriots don't need to make it anymore. So at the moment, I think it's kind of a combination of tin being much harder to get, but also not as many people wanting bronze. As a result, this is where iron comes in. Iron has been around a little bit before then, but not in a major way. But it really looks like we can point our fingers towards the Cypriots, especially in the 11th century. They turned from making bronze and just smelting copper to making iron, and they start exporting it. So we get weapons such as knives and daggers made of iron, but with bronze rivets. They're called bimetallic daggers, and they start showing up in Greece. So courtesy of the Cypriots. At about the same time, from the 11th century on, thereabouts, we also got the Phoenicians. Phoenicians are coming over from Canaan, what would today be the area of modern Lebanon. They are basically the survivors of the Canaanites. So most of the Canaanites kind of go kaput. They are one of the societies that in part disappears. But the Phoenicians are the survivors of the Canaanites in Beirut, Tyre, Sidon, that region. As I say, it's in modern Lebanon. And they're the ones that bring the alphabet back to Greece. And so the Greeks eventually adopt it. There's a big question as to when they did it. certainly by the end of the 8th century. But there are some who are presenting fairly convincing evidence that the alphabet may have shown up as early as the 11th century, in which case there's not a lot of time between the end of writing with Linear B and the beginning of writing in this new Greek alphabet that's adopted from the Phoenician, and they add in vowels and so on. So I think the Greeks basically come back up. Like I said, it took about 400 years, but they come back up with the help of people from the Near East, from Cyprus and from Phoenicia. Others, though, do it a different way. Let's see, the Hittites, for example, they're gone. They were in Central Anatolia. They're gone. Their place is taken by the Urartians, and then eventually the Phrygians and others like that. But there are some survivors. There's always some survivors. And these survivors are down in what we would call North Syria. They are the Neo-Hittites, the new Hittites. And they survive into the Iron Age at places like Carchemish and Tel Tayanat and other places like that. And they basically, well, the viceroy of Carchemish at first was one of the descendants of the Hittite royal family. So in effect, it continued there, but then they, go their own way and continue throughout the Iron Age. So this is a really interesting field with lots of new data from sites that are being excavated. So I would say that's an example. The Hittites are like the Canaanites. The main part disappears, is assimilated, but there are survivors. So Hittite survivors become the Neo-Hittites. Canaanite survivors become the Phoenicians. But elsewhere, like in the southern Levant, what would today be Israel and Jordan, those Canaanites basically go away, and we're going to get some of the new kingdoms. You're going to get Israel. You're going to get Judah. You're going to get Edom. You're going to get Moab, things like that. Smaller kingdoms, but they are going to move into the power vacuum when the Egyptians have retreated from Canaan and the Canaanites themselves go down. So you're going to get new kingdoms in the Iron Age. And so there, I would say that's collapse of the old and then complete takeover by the new. The Egyptians, they continue, they transform, but they're at a bit lower level. They kind of retreat into themselves. They're not as much a player on the international scene as they had been. We do get a rather famous story, the tale of Wenamun, of a guy from Egypt that goes up to Byblos and the region of the Phoenicians in about 1075 BC, so the beginning of the 11th century. And there's also now some evidence, new scientific evidence, that the Egyptians were looking for their copper to Jordan rather than to Cyprus during the late 20th dynasty into the 21st and 22nd dynasties. So we get new copper sources that Tom Levy and others have been excavating in Jordan and in Sinai. So we get transformations with Egypt. I would say the ones that survived the best, and this will be my last example, are the Assyrians. The Assyrians survived better than almost anybody else. In fact, it almost looks like they're not affected, at least to a certain extent, for a couple of decades more. The king continues, the administration continues, the writing continues, the massive building continues, the sculptures continue. And it almost looks like, Bronze Age collapse, Assyrians not affected. And I was wondering if maybe it's because they're on the Tigris and Euphrates. And maybe that's why the Egyptians weren't as affected, because they're on the Nile. But in both cases, it turns out, if you look deeper, both sets, the Assyrians and the Egyptians, are affected by drought, but it's a little bit later. So it's with the Assyrians, they continue on down right to about 1100 BC into the beginning of the 11th century. And then their texts start talking about drought and famine. and problems they're having with the Aramaeans, one of these new groups that's popping up. And so the Assyrians then go down for close to 200 years, but they don't disappear completely. They're just at a lower level. They've still got the king, they've still got central administration, but they're having problems. So they kind of internalize for a while.
Mm-hmm.
And then when they pop back up as the Neo-Assyrians, they promptly start ambushing and invading everybody else in the Eastern Mediterranean. And we get the start of the Neo-Assyrian Empire. Mm-hmm. And so, like, we've got the Phoenicians paying tribute to them. We've got battles fought and tributes paid by kings of Israel, kings of Judah, and so on. The Assyrians go up against the Neo-Hittites and the Urartians. And what I've found so far, and bear in mind, I'm still doing all the research and writing, mm-hmm. It looks like what the Assyrians had been getting by trade and diplomatic contacts back in the Bronze Age, they are now getting by war and invasion in the Iron Age. They still need all the raw materials and the finished goods and all that, but the Bronze Age, everybody had been happily interacting and doing mm-hmm. diplomacy and trade, and now that's been replaced by, hi, I'm here with my spear and my sword, give me what you got. Mm-hmm. So it is a lot more belligerent, it looks to me, in the Iron Age, at least the earlier part. And of course, the Neo-Assyrians end up taking over most of the Near East, only to be vanquished in turn by the Neo-Babylonians, who have been biding their time, and now they pop back up as well. Mm-hmm. So we've got many of the same players in the Iron Age, but all of them were affected. None of them escaped unscathed. Some of them went down for the count and never came back. Others, it took a long time to come back. And others just merely slightly tweaked what they had, transformed it, and kind of kept going. But mm-hmm. they are all affected by the drought that hits all of them.
Thank you. That kind of leads into my next question. And this, about this time last year, I remember looking on Twitter and seeing several archaeologists and academics saying, look, we have a plague, essentially. We have political unrest. We have climate change. This is looking an awful lot like the beginnings of a systems collapse. And I thought, oh, that's interesting and a little bit terrifying. So based on your research, do you think that this is something that we should be concerned about happening within our own time?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Mark Twain once said that history doesn't repeat, but it does rhyme, and I think he's absolutely correct. Yes, I would be completely worried about this, and in fact, that was how I ended the first edition of the book, and then the second edition, this one that just came out this past February, I both began and ended the book being worried about, could it happen again to us? And my conclusion is it could absolutely happen again to us if we're not careful. And one of the things that I ended this second edition with was a conversation I had with Adam Frank of NPR, who interviewed me after the first edition came out. And I was happily saying, oh, we're better off than like the Hittites were, because they didn't know what caused a drought, for example, and they didn't know really what to do about it. And I said, we're so much more scientifically advanced that if we recognize it, then we can, do something about it. And he just kind of looked at me and said, well, we may be advanced enough to recognize it, but are we really advanced enough to do anything about it? Mm-hmm. And I'm like, well, we'll have to wait and see. So that's what I've ended the second edition with the book, is saying, yes, I think we've got virtually every problem that they had that you could see could potentially have led to their collapse. I think we've got them all today. Mm-hmm. So the question is, what are we going to do about it? And that's where I say that ancient history absolutely matters. Mm-hmm. If we're willing to listen and learn and realize what happened back then And if we're not, how would I say this gently, if we're not too hubristic to say, oh, it could never happen to us. I mean, every civilization in the history of the world has eventually collapsed. We're not. Of course we're going to. It's not a matter of, are we going to collapse? It's a matter of when. So it could happen sooner rather than later. And this pandemic, that for me put the icing on the case, because the icing on the cake, because in the first edition of the book, I didn't even talk about disease because there's no evidence for it. Not really. It's like the missing thing from all the smoking guns. So what I did in the second edition is I put in the evidence from the plague that wiped out the Hittite royal family about 140 years earlier. And then also the news that Ramses V seems to have either had or died from smallpox in about 1140 BC. We know he had smallpox. You can see it on his mummy. And one of the Egyptian papyri, one of the Turin papyrus, says that they dug new graves for them, that they buried them 16 months after they died, he and the other members of his family, and then they quarantined the Valley of the Kings, which had never been done before. So I do think that there was disease at that time, late Bronze Age collapse. We just haven't really found it at the precise moment. But what had really got me thinking about it was the fact that we were all in lockdown because of COVID-19 and our pandemic. And I thought, well, even if there isn't disease back then, we've now got it today. So we've got everything they had plus. And that got me a little bit worried. Now, the thing is, I don't like running around like Chicken Little saying the sky is falling, the sky is falling. And that's not why I went into ancient history. You know, I'm fascinated by them, but I didn't go in to become, you know, a Cassandra and say, oh, you got to watch out. You got to, but I do see the things that happened back then. And, you know, it's of intellectual interest, if nothing else, to say, hey, we've got a lot of the same things again. What do you think? You want to bet whether we're going down or not? And so having seen that and having heard so much more in the interim about, are we going to collapse? And if we do, then what are we going to do about it? And that's when I thought that it would be interesting to look at how they dealt with the aftermath of their collapse. And I'm thinking, if we do collapse, it would be useful to know what to do and what not to do. And if we don't collapse, well, at least it's an interesting study. And the Iron Age in its own way is just as fascinating as the Bronze Age. And I think even fewer people know what happened then and don't realize that it's actually not quite as dark a period as we thought it was. It was mostly a matter of us not having excavated the sites from that time period. So the Dark Ages are getting lighter and lighter and lighter, if you will. And so anyway, so I'm hoping the sequel will be as relevant.
So based on that, then, do you see anything that we can do to try and maybe mitigate a collapse or try and hold it off for a little longer, or to rebound more successfully once it happens?
Yeah, I think there is. I mean, and again, this is something I'm wary of doing, of getting out of my lane, you know, my specialty. I'm an ancient historian and an archaeologist. I look back. It's not for me to tell people that are forward-looking what they should do. But I think it's some of the obvious things are, if we see climate change, and if we see that humans are accelerating and making it worse, then we should perhaps stop doing that. And yeah, you would think, try and mitigate the damage that we're doing. But also, one of the things that I think caused them problems is that none of them were self-sufficient back then. They were all very heavily dependent on each other. And so when the supply chain was broken, and like I said, if they couldn't get tin anymore and they can't make bronze, that's going to have a major impact. So I think we've got the same sort of thing here. Not that I'm espousing that everybody needs to be self-sufficient, but we need redundancy in place. So if something fails, we've got a backup and then a backup to the backup. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, just look at what happened at the beginning of the pandemic. There were shortages everywhere because of things in China, which affected Korea, which affected us. I mean, suddenly, if I remember correctly, we were having trouble getting Kia automobiles. And I mean, even now, the supply of chips is affecting everything from computers to cars to this and that. So again, I would say that if we are going to either weather a collapse or be resilient enough to come out of it doing fairly well on the other side, that we should try to be somewhat self-sufficient, but not at the expense of our globalized economy, because it's wonderful what we've got. But a series of redundancies would be very, very, very good. And even if it doesn't come to the point that we collapse, you know, we're fighting a mega drought out in California and the western states in the US. We've got to do something about that as well. So all of these, that can serve multiple purposes, let's put it that way. So there are any number of ways that we can try to prevent a collapse, but I think most of it's common sense. And most of it is, paying attention to this thing we call science, right? If the scientists are telling us this, they can probably also tell us how we can help, get around it, right? So again, not my role to be telling them what to do, but I think it is my role to be telling people, hey, this is what I see happened in antiquity, and it looks like it's happening again. So maybe we should talk to the experts and hear what they have to say as to how to stop it, how to stop history from rhyming, as our friend Mark Twain said.
Excellent advice all round, I think. Thank you very much for that. We are going to take a very brief 60-second break. If you have questions for Dr. Cline, please put them in the chat and tag me at Digital Hammurabi to make sure I see them. We're going to have a super quick question and answer session, and then I'm going to let him go and get on with his Saturday. So we will be right back. If you'd like an expert to answer your questions, then make sure you join us live next time. Check out digitalhammurabi.com/calendar for details of future interviews. And remember to bring your questions. And we are back. Thank you, everybody. So we are going to get right into our question and answer session. Big Zebra asks, I know that bronze is made of copper and tin, but I remember antimony being useful in the alloy too. Was antimony used in the late Bronze Age?
It's a good question. I've never heard of antimony being used, but that may be just my ignorance. What I have heard, a good substitute, well, I use the word good advisedly, but arsenic works. So if you don't have tin, you can use arsenic, and we do have arsenical copper. And as I said, good is advisory, because if you use arsenic, you're not going to live very long. But that's what I've heard, is that arsenic can replace the tin.
Lovely, thank you. Raphael says, what about the Philistines? Are they really Greek? If so, are they Mycenaeans or Minoans?
This is an excellent question, and we've got some new data, hopefully, about this. So in the group of sea peoples that the Egyptians mentioned, they talk about one group called the Peleset, and we think they are the Philistines. To my mind, and it's just my opinion, I do think that they come from the Aegean. Their pottery and such looks very Mycenaean to me. I actually usually describe it to my students as degenerate Mycenaean, which is not a pejorative. It simply means that it's Mycenaean shapes and decorations, but is made with clay from Rhodes, Cyprus, Canaan, rather than from mainland Greece or Crete. But so to my mind, the Philistines look very much like they're from the Aegean. Whether they're Mycenaeans or Minoans, I don't know. But a couple of things come into play here. If you follow the biblical account, they talk about the Philistines being from Kaftor, Keftiu, namely Crete, basically. But there's also now some new DNA evidence that was announced in the summer of, I want to say, 2017, of 4 infants from the site of Ashkelon, where they are not sea peoples themselves, these little kids, but probably their grandchildren is what I would guess, because they're from later in the 12th century and into the early 11th century. But the DNA shows that they are partially Canaanite and partially other, shall we say. Mm-hmm. And the computer modeling says that the most likely origin for that external DNA is Crete or mainland Greece, mm-hmm. Sardinia, or Iberia, that is Spain. Wow. Yeah. So, and out of all of them, they said that the computer modeling, if I understand it, and they've been redoing it from time to time, it's pointing to Crete as the most likely place. And that would fit in well with the biblical account, but it would also fit in well with what we already knew from archaeology. Because in addition to the vase shapes and decorations looking similar to the Aegean, there are other things that we associate with the Philistines, hearths, bathtubs, so on and so forth. And it really looks like the Philistines, they come in and they assimilate, they settle down perhaps a bit more peacefully than we had thought. And I go into all of this in the book, especially more. I've got the little infants from Ashkelon in the 2nd edition. So the long answer to your question is, yes, I think they do come from the Aegean. I do think they are Mycenaean or Minoan migrants or refugees or what have you, but they are transforming, they are morphing, and they settle down and assimilate such that the other DNA that was done at Ashkelon from people living a little bit earlier, or sorry, a little bit later, you can see that they've completely assimilated. Mm-hmm. So it's really interesting how they just, resistance is futile. Maybe not.
Fascinating. Thank you. Jared asks, we are even more dependent on others than they were back then. Shouldn't that make a collapse even worse?
Well, potentially, yes. But if we are dependent on others and they don't collapse, I mean, let's say only a part of it collapses, then they might help us come back up, much as the Cypriots and the Phoenicians seem to have helped the Greeks get back on their feet during the Iron Age. So, but yes, potentially the collapse could be worse. And what I think of in particular, back then, only maybe 1% of the people we think could have read and write, that they were literate. Probably even most of the kings and queens couldn't read or write, and the scribes would read stuff out to them. Well, think about us today, how dependent we are on email and computers and digitization. And what about if part of our collapse involved all of that system going away? I mean, we've all experienced a power outage, or even just when the internet went down for a couple of hours. And I don't know about you, but I'm completely lost. I'm like, oh my God, I can't get on the web. Yep. What's going on? Imagine if the collapse involves that, and all of our infrastructure and hardware goes down as well. Then yes, the collapse would be even worse. Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you. We have more questions than we can get to. I'm going to ask 2 more, and then we're going to call it a day. So I'm sorry to everyone whose questions we haven't got to. I appreciate you asking them and putting them in. Ben asks, does the new book touch on the evolution of state religions from the late Bronze Age to the Iron?
Well, it will to some extent. I'm right now working more on the historical facts, what actually happened, but there will be some. I mean, when you got Israel and Judah coming in, obviously you've got new religions coming into the picture here. Again, though, that is a bit out of my lane. I'm not a religious historian or a biblical scholar, so I will touch upon it, but I'm frankly more interested personally in the evolution of state administration and how they dealt with all of that. But I'm hopeful that others will pick up on it as well. And so the answer to your question is yes, a little bit, but probably not as much as you would wish I would do. So, but hopefully there'll be others.
Lovely, thank you. And this, again, is a little outside of your lane, but how much of the causes or consequences of the late Bronze Age collapse are reflected in other world regions? What would the effects be on the Eastern Mediterranean?
So this is an excellent question and something that I've been wondering about myself. There are any number of people that have said in, Amazon reviews, Twitter remarks, and all that, boy, you're just talking about this one narrow region of the world, from what is today Italy to Afghanistan and Turkey down to Egypt. What about China? What about India? What about Australia? What about North America? And my answer is, well, look, I was looking at this interconnected, globalized for its time, that particular area. And so I wasn't talking about any of the others because they're not involved in that world system. Having said that, it is of interest to know if any other areas in the world were affected, say, by the drought. So we know, for instance, that there was an earlier mega drought, 1,000 years earlier. In the parlance of those who study such things, my collapse, the late Bronze Age collapse, is the 3.2 event. Well, there was an event at 4.2, which is thousands of years ago, that ended the early Bronze Age. And Harvey Weiss of Yale University and others have studied this and have said that they found evidence for that earlier drought on all the continents in the world. And so they think it was a worldwide event. Now, as far as I know, nobody has looked at the 3.2 event, the late Bronze Age, to see if that's worldwide or not. So it's a very interesting question. I would love it if we could get a whole series of scientists to say, yes or no. We've got that in Australia, North America, and China and India. And so I honestly don't know right now if it's a worldwide event or if it's localized. We do know that there are, drought conditions up in Europe at about this time, but whether it spreads further, we don't know. So I think we've only just really started to investigate this period, and it may well spread out. India does collapse also earlier. The Harappan civilization has collapsed earlier in the second millennium. It may be part of the 4.2 event. And we know, of course, that there was anarchy in Mesopotamia at the beginning of the second millennium. That's all part of the earlier problems, but whether we have it later in our period as well is, I think, a fascinating question that remains to be explored.
Wonderful. Well, Dr. Cline, thank you so much for your time. This has been absolutely fascinating, and I really appreciate you coming to talk with us.
My pleasure, my pleasure. And again, thank you for making me part of this absolutely wonderful day.
Oh, absolutely. And for those who don't know what's going on today, it is Ancient History Day on YouTube, at least for like 19 of us. So we're all making amazing ancient history YouTube videos. If you are interested and you want to follow along with what's going on, there is a full schedule on my website. The link has been scrolling across the bottom of your screens. The next video in the series is World of Antiquity, How Much History is in Myth. They are starting in about 15 minutes, so you have time to go get yourself a cup of coffee or a cup of tea. And we're going to keep going until 6, so you can dip in and out as you want. The next video in the series will always be referenced by the video that you're watching, so you can just keep going. So thank you all so much. It's been a lovely afternoon, and I'm sure we will see you later.